previous video, we explored the Arado R-234 Blitz, a technological marvel of the Luftwaffe that graced the skies over Europe late in World War II. At that very same time, another star was rising to prominence. The Vought F-4U Corsair. Though built for different missions, both were cutting-edge machines that represented the peak of aviation engineering for their day. Regrettably, reliable historical accounts show no recorded dogfights between the F-4U Corsair and the Arado R-234 Blitz. But if these two legends had ever met in combat, who do you think would have prevailed? In the European theater, the F-4U Corsair saw limited use with the British Fleet Air Arm. It was primarily assigned to anti-shipping missions, like the operation targeting the battleship Tirpitz in Norway, or to ground support roles following the D-Day landings. They seldom ventured deep into German airspace. In the Pacific, however, the Corsair truly cemented its legacy going head-to-head with formidable Japanese fighter aircraft. The Vought F-4U Corsair is one of history's most iconic aircraft. Its 11-year production run was longer than any other American fighter of the period, and it holds the distinction of being the last piston-engine fighter ever manufactured for the United States Armed Forces. Joining the fight in 1943, the Corsair offered Allied pilots a decisive edge with its superior speed, ruggedness, and heavy firepower. Serving as both a fighter and a ground attack plane, it racked up an astonishing 11-to-1 kill ratio. Its most famous trait, however, was the eerie whistle it produced at high speed, which led the enemy to nickname it the Whistling Death. The Corsair's distinctive bent wings make it easily recognizable, although its full capabilities are not as well known as those of other more famous aircraft. Despite this, the F-4U was able to outfight not just the best Axis fighters, but also those of the Allies. They were powerful, quick, well-armed, durable, and dependable. In short, they were ideal fighters. While most aircraft types had orders canceled before the end of the war, the F-4U remained at the center of a hectic development and production program. For those who enjoy debating the relative merits of World War II fighters, its continued development demonstrates how highly regarded it was by the United States Navy and Marine Corps. The Corsair was not only produced and used in the jet age, but it also engaged in battle with jet fighters in Korea, and the results were not always favorable to the jets. The F-4U's unusual wing reflects the character of the team that created it. Vought engineers have frequently used unconventional methods where they have proven effective, possibly reflecting the company's long history. Vought is the second oldest surviving aviation firm, following Boeing having been founded in June 1917. Back then, intuition was as trustworthy as science in aircraft design, and Vought has never been one to dismiss the unexpected out of hand. Over the years, the firm has produced significant contributions to aviation in general, and specifically to U.S. naval aircraft. On October 17, 1922, the first aircraft to take off from the deck of the Langley, the United States Navy's original aircraft carrier, was a Vought V-7. This was merely one of several such historical moments for the company. Previously, VE-7s armed the Navy's first two fighter units. The Navy and the corporation have maintained a partnership that benefits both parties. Chance Milton Vought, who was born on February 26, 1890 in New York, founded the corporation. His father built sailing ships for a business. But after finishing his mechanical engineering studies, the young man abandoned the sea and began working with flying vehicles in 1910. Chance Vought died young in 1930, but by then he had established a flourishing business that had withstood multiple transfers across the United States, as well as changes in ownership and leadership. The company's reputation for producing high-quality aircraft dates back to its early designs, and the F-4U was expected to carry on this legacy. The company's first plane was created in a third-floor room of an abandoned ladies' stocking factory. It was lowered to the street in pieces via the windows, then reassembled to test the engine while the plane was tethered to a telephone pole. Despite this unusual origin, the design was extremely successful. The plane was known as the VE-7, with the letters VE standing for Vought Experimental, and 7 representing Chance Vaught's 7th design. It was simply advertised as a 2-seat advanced trainer, but its reception by Army pilots in 1918 was so positive that it was ordered into mass production as a fighter. After the war, some production of the VE-7 continued, including the first orders from the Navy. Several versions made their way into Navy service. There were twin-seat observation and float planes, as well as single-seat fighters. Vaught's following plane, the VE-8, was comparable to the VE-7 in many ways. The business relied on the VE-7 in many ways, and the VE-7 family was built until the 1930s, though not as fighters. Vought continued to develop fighter prototypes, but with little success. These aircraft were extremely outstanding, including the company's first all-metal plane. However, they were market failures, and Vought was only able to stay in business because of the successful sales of other aircraft, especially a series of observation planes known as Corsairs. This is a moniker that has been strongly connected with Vought. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Vought company quietly prospered. It was modest and sometimes failed to satisfy orders, but it nonetheless had successful concepts in manufacturing. These featured the Vindicator light bomber and the Kingfisher catapult plane, but they were unable to develop an effective fighter design. The VE-141 was a stunning failure. Despite engineering complaints, the corporation's president purchased a doubtful Northrop fighter design. 2 test versions, which were being evaluated by the Army and Navy in 1935, vanished without a trace. The plane had poor spin recovery, and despite the best efforts of the Vought crew, it remained perilous. The V-143 was renamed after being lengthened and receiving a new tail, but it still failed to attract any purchasers. To recoup some of the damage, the plans were eventually sold to Japan, a choice that the Japanese most likely regretted thereafter. The Vought company vowed to stick to its own designs in the future. Meanwhile, in 1936, Rex Beisel, the company's chief engineer, began work on another fighter for the Navy. The design was complete and submitted in 1938. This would be the firm's 6th fighter submission, but the first to be successful. The firm referred to it as the V-166, although it was tested as the XF-4U. Beisel designed the smallest feasible aircraft around a Pratt & Whitney concept, for a massive supercharged double wasp radial engine producing 1,800 horsepower. At the time, it was the world's most powerful engine. After one major adjustment placing a fuel tank ahead of the cockpit, the design consolidated and became the unmistakable F4U Corsair. The first production plane would not be delivered until more than 4 years after the initial test order, during which time Europe had descended into a global war. With war raging, the company's pilots who took the early production planes for test flights were confident that the Corsair would soon make contact. They admired the plane's capabilities and hoped to acquire widespread fame. On October 1st, 1940, the initial X-plane became the first United States fighter to reach over 400 miles per hour in level flight. This not only validated faith in the radial engine, but also confirmed to the Navy that this was the aircraft required to fill the duty of carrier fighter. The massive engine was not only critical to the plane's capabilities, but it also had a significant impact on its appearance. It was coupled to a massive 3-bladed propeller. At 13 feet 4 inches, it was the biggest on any Boxer at the time. By comparison, the Messerschmitt 109 had a diameter of just under 10 feet. Vought was a subsidiary of the United Aircraft Corporation, which also owned Sikorsky. The corporation also included Pratt & Whitney, which manufactured the plane's engine. The Hamilton Standard Company, which manufactured the Corsair's propeller, was also part of the group. It's easy to forget that what's commonplace today was once cutting-edge technology. This is especially true for something as seemingly ordinary as a fighter's propeller. No matter how good the engine is, it was only built to accomplish one thing: drive a propeller. And it was a design challenge to see how well the prop matched the power plant in order to get the most out of the plane. The Hamilton Standard Company used the most advanced technology available. The props were made around a cold, stretched steel core with silver skins welded on. The method generated incredibly precise results and long-lasting form. Propeller design, like all other parts of aircraft technology, required a combination of expertise, understanding, and testing. This is an ongoing process of improvement, and the Corsair represented the pinnacle of a particular technology: prop-driven fighters. The Corsair's power plant was a twin-row 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine. With an initial bore of 5 3/4 inches and a stroke of 6 inches, it had a capacity of 2,804 cubic inches. By the end of the war, Pratt & Whitney engines were being produced in over 30 sites across the United States. 26 of them were under the company's control, while 6 other companies were making the engines for a modest wartime license charge. Pre-war styles dictated that the air-cooled engine would be phased out in favor of the Europeans' preferred liquid-cooled inline power plants. However, for carrier applications, the radial provided weight maintenance and supply advantages that warranted its ongoing usage. Despite popular belief, the P-47 Thunderbolt and Corsair, 2 of the United States' greatest fighters of the war and the first to achieve 400 miles per hour, had radial engines. The F-4U was built to be a brutally effective fighter, but it was difficult to land, which slowed its full acceptance into service. The Navy had no doubts about the plane's exceptional performance as a fighter, but there was rising unease. Was it safe to operate from a carrier? Landings on carriers must be swift and precise. Otherwise, you have not landed but rather crashed. As a result, pilots often crash their planes hard in search of a successful hookup. The pilot requires clear visibility to place the plane and a sturdy surface to absorb the shock. With their long-standing ties with the Navy, the Vought engineers were well versed in carrier landing procedures. They also knew everything that could go wrong. The Navy filmed every landing on its carriers, and the collapse of landing gear was documented on a large amount of Navy film. The Vought designers had thoroughly researched the behavior of aircraft under these severe strains, especially since so many of the planes in Navy service were Vought designs. Even with slow and steady biplanes, landing on a ship required a great deal of violence. There were solutions to the problem, including better landing gear, more pilot visibility, and improved training. The pilots would constantly be stressed while landing, and it was the role of aircraft designers to reduce the risks. Furthermore, the Navy was extremely cautious about anything that could increase the pilot's workload. The F-4U was built from the start as a carrier fighter. Hence, significant thought went into making its landing gear as sturdy as possible. The massive propeller required a lot of ground clearance. This would have required a very high landing gear. The inverted gull wings were created expressly to compensate. The Vought team was undeterred by an unorthodox wing. A fighter needed as much power as possible, and if a weird wing was the best way to give it, so be it. However, the Navy was not convinced of the plane's carrier safety. The cockpit was relocated far back down the fuselage, reducing visibility during landing. This meant that pilots would be blind during the final approach. The landing gear would be subjected to higher than normal forces, and pilots would have to concentrate more than usual. Despite astonishingly successful tests, the Navy was hesitant to commit its carriers to the Corsair's protection. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a more traditional aircraft, was preferred. Despite being developed as carrier planes, the initial U.S. Corsairs were limited to land-based service with the Marine Corps. The Pacific theater, with its vast distances and scattered islands, was dominated by airplanes. Possession of airspace would dictate the fighter's trajectory, culminating in the island-hopping drive that shattered the Japanese Empire. The first significant fight took place near the airport at Lunga Point on the island of Guadalcanal. The Japanese had started work in the field. The goal of the Allied invasion had been to secure the field before Japanese planes could begin using it. As soon as the Marines arrived on shore, it was their turn, and the airfield would be the site of a lengthy battle for the next 5 months. The struggle was so furious that planes took off from the strip before it was over, despite the danger. Accidents were unavoidable, and with combat damage and furious ground warfare, the strip's edge quickly became strewn with crashed aircraft. The Marines were equipped with a variety of Navy aircraft, including Grumman F-4F Wildcat test fighters. The Grummans were overpowered by the Zero. Therefore, Marine pilots depended on tactics and collaboration to compete with the Japanese. Throughout the conflict, the Japanese frequently underestimated American power on Guadalcanal. In the process of continuing piecemeal deployments, they committed a significant number of troops and machines to fight. If it had all been devoted to the battle at once, it could have been overwhelming. Instead, it was delivered in little bundles and brutally torn up by United States Marines. The cost to the United States was considerable. Japanese losses were much greater. The airstrip on Guadalcanal, renamed Henderson Field, was completed and became a valuable asset in the ongoing conflict in the Solomon Islands. Steel matting stabilized the surface, making operations safer. The Marines settled into a lengthy occupation. When the Japanese abandoned their efforts to expel the Marines from Guadalcanal in January 1943, they had already incurred significant losses. Nonetheless, Japan maintained a considerable military presence. At the time, they still had planes that outperformed their American counterparts, but pilot casualties were reducing their effectiveness. The contest was far from over, and there would be fierce combat ahead. The first Corsairs arrived at the theater to take part in the combat. The Marines were well aware of the concerns regarding the Corsair and approached their new aircraft with caution. This gradually dissipated as the pilots' experience with the F-4U convinced them of the machine's value. Marine pilots rapidly boasted that they were flying the best aircraft in the world.
First time I went overseas, I flew Wildcat, Grumman Wildcats, F4Fs. It is a pretty primitive airplane. Didn't have a hydraulic system. You crank the gear up and you crank the gear down and you charge the guns with a cable, ran out to the wings. And I ended up on this island of Samoa. And then it went up to a little island in the Central Pacific below, about 700 miles south of Tarawa. The Japanese were bombing us at night, yes, yeah. We'd get in a foxhole and have to tolerate it, but, you know, they didn't have any air to air. They'd come down and bomb us, but they'd always bomb us at night, and so we wasn't able to compete with them, and so I really didn't do much that first 13 months overseas. The Japanese were moving that direction. They were in the Marshall Islands and also the Gilbert Islands, and so we were there to keep them from moving any further south, yeah. My first deployment was 13 months, yeah. That was about all of 1943. And then I came back and instructed and got into Corsairs, and Wildcat didn't have a hydraulic system. The Corsair did. You know, you charge the guns hydraulically and folded the wings, everything. Even raised the gear hydraulically to where the Wildcat you cranked. You know, whistling death. They claim the Japanese nicknamed it. I had about 1,025 hours in the Corsair, and I never have had an accident or anything, and so I'm pretty well impressed with it. It had a lot of power. I went back overseas again in January of 1945. Shot down two airplanes, two Japanese airplanes. My first flight was the 12th of of April 1945, and we climbed to 20,000 feet and looking for airplanes, and finally the fighter director, vectored us north, and we didn't see any, and so I looked down low and saw some airplanes, and so I decided to go down and check it out, and I kind of broke through some clouds, and there was 4 zeros right in front of me, and so I picked on the tail end Charlie, and he exploded, and I went on past him, and I thought, well, gosh, there's 3 Jap behind me, and so I rolled over and I went down and I reached compressibility. The stick got to jumping around, and but I pulled out about 9,000 feet and said I was going home. I didn't think anything about me hurting anybody in that airplane at all. But I knew he was after me and I was after him, and it was pretty exciting, you know. I thought, well, this is what I've been working for a long time now.
Eventually, their voices would be heard. On February 12, 1943, the Corsair's combat career began with the arrival of a squadron at Henderson Field. By dusk, the majority of the pilots had registered 9 hours of activity. The next day, they escorted bombers to Bougainville, a mission that had previously been ruled out due to the fighter's limited range. The coming of the Corsair brought about many changes. Henderson's circumstances remained fairly rudimentary. As was typical of wartime Marine stations, with the majority of servicing taking place outside or in tents, the Corsairs were maintained and armed, refueled, and quickly turned around. They had to be available at all times as both a defensive and offensive force. VMF 124, the first squadron on Guadalcanal, proved the Corsair's success. During their tour of service, they downed 68 Japanese planes, losing 11 Corsairs and 3 pilots. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, the squadron's first F4U ace, shot down his 5th fighter on May 13th. Walsh eventually had 21 combat victories confirmed. The Corsairs were now being produced in huge numbers, and the eager Marines welcomed them. The F4Us had a minor role in the European theater. In the Pacific, they became a dominant force in combat. Throughout the long, slogging fight through the islands, the Corsairs offered the Marines an advantage over the finest Japanese tanks. In addition to achieving air superiority, they were effective fighter bombers in close support of ground forces. The 1st Navy Corsair Squadron began operations in April 1943. This was VF-17. The aircraft were still not certified for carrier usage. Therefore, they were flown from land bases. In 79 days, the Corsairs destroyed 154 aircraft. 12 of the squadron's pilots earned aces. In a letter to the Vought Company in May, Old Admiral Nimitz noted that the daily fights in the South Pacific had already demonstrated that the Corsair is a superior plane over any variant of the Zero. Corsairs were equipped with either 6 half-inch machine guns or 4 20mm cannons. versatility of this armament left a lasting impression on the men who flew the Corsair, who often felt they were at the controls of the best fighter in the world, even when compared to other legendary Allied aircraft.
The Jim Sweat out of Guadalcanal, where he got the Medal of Honor, knew all the tricks of the trade. And he had just flown the Corsair, the F4U 1A, they called it, just before he left Guadalcanal. So he had a good head start on using the F4D. I mean, the F4U 1D that we had. We could do 425 knots at 10,000 feet, full power. That was pretty good.
That's a great airplane.
It was better than 51. We could do more. We could carry more ammunition. We carried bombs. We carried air-to-air rockets. Air-to-ground rockets. And we had 6 50 caliber machine guns with 250 rounds in each gun.
Nice.
So that came in real handy when you took some time to get up to 20, 30,000 feet. You had fuel and ammunition to do a lot of different things, depending on what you were called to do.
This allowed the F-4U to launch a deadly attack on the Japanese tanks with minimal armor. In contrast to the fragility of the Japanese planes, the F-4U was designed to withstand damage and remain together. The massive engine provided sufficient power to support the weight of the armor. The plane featured self-sealing tanks and a strong structure. To down a Corsair, the Japanese pilot needed a lot of luck or tenacity. The Corsairs established a fearsome reputation in air-to-air combat while under Marine command. The Japanese understood the significance of the Corsair's arrival. They had lost their superiority with the Zero, and they had little prospect of regaining it. Victory rolls and swoops over Corsair bases were common as pilots celebrated their victories. A total of 9,441 F-4U-1s were built. This number encompassed various subtypes and numerous changes. During the F-4U-1 production process, 500 major engineering changes and nearly 2,500 minor improvements were made in total. Several countries would utilize Corsairs during the war. Specifically, the British secured far over 2,000 Schnur for use with their fleet air arm. Unlike the United States Navy, the English were quick to recognize the plane's capabilities. The fact that it possessed great landing qualities was secondary to its demonstrated power. As a result, they deployed the Corsair to their carriers. When the United States Navy came to reconsider the Corsair for its carriers, British excitement proved to be a powerful motivator. The British had pioneered carrier aviation and had a significant influence on its evolution. British testing and theory had paved the way, and their views were respected. Despite their stodgy reputation, the British were often very adventurous. Reducing the concept of a floating runway to its bare minimum demonstrates this, while it also implies a potentially more indifferent attitude toward aircrew losses. Certainly, the British were not intimidated by the Corsairs. They were soon flying them from tiny escort carriers, having trimmed 8 inches off the wings to fit below decks. Initially, the British had a difficult time. The pilot's seat was too low, which paired with being so far back, resulted in very poor visibility. In addition, the undercarriage was overly bouncy. These were the same concerns that prompted the United States Navy to reject the plane for carrier use. The British persisted with carrier trials and addressed the design's flaws by implementing a curving landing approach. Landings improved as the pilot lost sight of the deck at the final second. Later changes raised the pilot's seat and stiffened the landing gear, substantially reducing the risk of landing. In April 1944, in response to the British experience and the enthusiasm of Marine pilots, the United States Navy launched a second round of Corsair trials aboard the escort carrier Gambier Bay. The success of these tests eventually reversed the earlier decision, and the F4U was certified for carrier operation. The first Corsairs to operate from U.S. carriers in action were land-based Navy planes that were flown onto carriers to refuel and rearm on November 11, 1943. There had been other isolated occurrences of Corsairs being damaged or running low on fuel landing on ships. On January 3, 1945, the first United States carrier-based squadron went into action on Okinawa. These were Marine pilots with Corsair expertise who had been sent to fly from the USS Essex. The Corsairs were simply the most formidable fighter aircraft available, and the Navy relied heavily on them. The frenzy of kamikaze strikes that had begun in the Philippines would last until the conclusion of the war, and the Corsairs as interceptors provided the greatest available forward defense. During the Pacific War, United States Corsairs shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft. The Marines shot down more than 1,600 of them. In reply, 189 Corsairs were destroyed in air-to-air combat. This gives the Corsair a more than 11-to-1 advantage. In addition to air-to-air losses, anti-aircraft fire and other factors resulted in the loss of 768 American F4Us. When the F4Us entered carrier service prior to the Okinawa invasion, their primary purpose was to protect the Allied task forces from the mounting threat of kamikaze strikes. Kamikazes verified the United States' suspicions about Japanese fanaticism. Japanese soldiers had astonished their American opponents by fighting till the last man. Japanese sailors swam away from their ships attempting to rescue them in shark-infested waters. In the final days of the Empire, young men flew their planes as guided bombs onto Allied ships. This was a truly unusual and dangerous phenomenon. The sheer scale of this suicide strategy, extending beyond aircraft, was a shocking reality for the Allied forces. Despite their losses, the kamikaze strikes created devastation. Even if 90% of an attacking force was shot down, the remaining 10% may be dangerous. The only ships relatively immune to the raids were battleships and several British carriers with armored decks. The attacks were so regular and often in great numbers that the Allied ships took a lot of damage. However, at no point did the campaign have any potential of influencing the result of the war. The Allied resources were insufficient, and Japan was already in a vulnerable position. The Corsairs' debut on the carriers coincided with the peak of kamikaze attacks. Around Okinawa, the Japanese defiantly launched both massed and smaller operations. 10 massed attacks accounted for approximately 2,500 sorties out of a total of around 3,000 attacks over 3 months. More than 400 ships were hit. This works out to around 1 strike for every 8 aircraft lost. If the Japanese hadn't run out of planes first, they'd have run out of volunteers. Despite the Corsair's ability to intercept incoming strikes, the kamikaze nevertheless managed to get through in large numbers. With F-4Us now flying from all carrier task groups, some Corsairs were also caught in the kamikaze fire. The greatest spot for a burning plane is astern underwater. Throughout the conflict, specialists fine-tuned their damage and fire control skills. Early carrier losses on both sides revealed a misunderstanding of the significance of these measures. In 1945, things had changed. Pre-war theory and procedures had been frequently tried and tempered in the harsh realities of experience. Over 4,500 strikes on Japanese ships were carried out by United States Corsairs, with more than 500 of them being against portions. The F-4U cannons were extremely efficient against unarmored merchantmen. Even armored ships were vulnerable to rockets and bombs. The dual role of interceptor and ground attack bomber is vividly brought to life by the memories of the pilots themselves. The word Japanese transportation has become a paradox. The unfettered onslaught of Allied planes inflicted catastrophic destruction at sea and on land. The conclusion of the war came at a pivotal point in aviation history. With the emergence of the jet propeller-driven aircraft became aerodynamically inefficient. The United States did not want the Royal Navy to lend out Corsairs, and the British did not want to pay for them. To follow the wording of the law, it was agreed that the British would push them over the side. Everyone was reducing the military establishment. Everyone was reducing their use of propeller-driven aircraft. Despite appearing to dwarf the Phantom, the Corsair weighs only 2,000 pounds more. However, it could carry a bigger load of more diverse armaments for around double the jets. In addition, the Phantom was just 30 miles per hour faster than the Corsair. Prop planes retained significant advantages over the new jets, and some would continue to be needed. The United States Navy and Marine Corps decided to keep the Corsair, and it wasn't just about the WWII aircraft. New versions would be created and manufactured. The F-4U was still in production and performing combat missions throughout America's next war, Korea. Corsair's frequent close involvement, both from the carriers and within the encirclement at Busan, played a significant role in the conflict. The F-4Us, like other World War II aircraft, such as Mustangs and Invaders, could carry a massive payload and loiter for hours. They may provide accurate close support while also tying up road and rail linkages. During the conflict, they planned to largely destroy Wallachia and weaken the country. As was so often the case during World War II, carriers played a significant role in establishing control of the skies above Korea. This was eventually decisive. China's vast stockpiles could not be risked under the harsh umbrella of American air superiority. In order to sustain the resulting stalemate, the Chinese had to balance their losses. Even still, Chinese and North Korean casualties were massive. The Corsair had evolved from its origins as a combat aircraft to become remarkably versatile. The Marines had converted it into a dive bomber and rocket platform. By the time of Korea, it could be armed with napalm 4,000 pounds of bombs or 10 rockets. This was in addition to the 4 20mm cannons. The carrier attack squadrons of Corsairs and Douglas Sky Raiders created a formidable combination. The Marines' well-coordinated efforts in Korea further demonstrated the Corsairs' exceptional qualities. The large workhorses handled the simple strips and buckling matting without complaint. However, the harshness of the winter created numerous complications. There were times during the war when all aviation activity was suspended. The airplanes were frozen. Similarly, the Chinese were unable to make significant progress in such conditions. The demand for Corsair services was so high that several of the planes were recalled from reserve groups to fight throughout the conflict. Their strengths in the close support role were unparalleled. The Navy needed them on the front lines. Perhaps there were some misgivings over the pile of ex-British Corsairs decaying deep in the Pacific. During the vital first 10 months of the war, Corsairs flew 82% of the Navy and Marine tactical support missions. One squadron, VNF 323, flew nearly 100 flights in a month. The first Corsair strikes of the war occurred on July 3, 1950, just 8 days after hostilities began. This marked the start of several successful raids on northern transport and supplies. In addition, the North's airfields were shut down. North Korean airfields could not. In August 1952, Captain Jesse Fulmer became the first American to shoot down a MiG-15 with a propeller-driven plane. Another MiG immediately smashed his Corsair, but he had added another chapter to the F-4U mythology. Airstrikes by United States Marines and Navy Corsairs continued until the final day of the combat, July 27, 1953. By the end of the war, the Corsairs' days were over. Production ended in December 1952, and the last Corsairs and fighter and attack squadrons were transferred to reserve status in December 1954. The reserves flew them until 1957, and the French used them until October 1964. An impressive set of dates. The design dates from 1938. Jets were still under development in Korea, whereas props were well established and polished. F-4Us executed frantic defensive work early in the campaign, and their aggressive work in the later rounds was equally convincing. Post-war models increasingly represented ground attack requirements and eliminated aircraft trappings. The Corsairs had become even more resilient, albeit at the expense of some performance. Some Corsairs have been repaired after retirement to outperform their original specifications. The robust airframes have been modified. This plane has been rebuilt as a pylon racer and equipped with a massive 4,000 horsepower radial. The engine is from a large post-war cargo plane, while the prop is from an AD Sky Raider. The airplane is quite fast. Squadron VC-4 was the last United States Navy user of the F-4U, flying its final Corsair, a night fighter F-4U-5N, in December 1955. The last reserve flight was made by the Akron, Ohio unit in July 1957. The Corsairs are no longer flying except for a few that have been preserved in museums. A total of 12 571 Corsairs were constructed. Vought built 7 830 of them, with Goodyear building the majority of the rest, and the Brewster Company building a few. There were 36 major subtypes and thousands of minor changes between different batches of planes. Their decline from being the world's best fighter resulted in them becoming the world's best ground support aircraft. They also performed well as night fighters. Both Japanese and American pilots acknowledged the Corsair as the Allies' best fighter, and both agreed it was superior to whatever the Japanese had. Their minimal impact in Europe has resulted in them being frequently forgotten among the World War's best fighters. In this discussion, protagonists frequently extol the virtues of Focke-Wulf's Mustangs and Spitfires. This seems to reflect the European experience. Veterans of the Pacific campaigns, particularly the Marines, frequently back a different nominee. The Chance Vought Corsair, the story of the Vought F-4U. Vought F-4U Corsair is far more than a technical overview of a vintage warplane. It is a testament to engineering perseverance, battlefield adaptability, and the sheer will to create a superior fighting machine. Born from an unconventional design that initially presented significant challenges, the Corsair evolved from a difficult carrier, hopeful into the undisputed master of the Pacific skies, feared by its enemies, and revered by the pilots who flew it, especially the United States Marines. Its legacy was cemented not only in the island-hopping campaigns of World War II, but also in its surprising and vital role as a ground attack workhorse in the Korean War, proving that the pinnacle of piston engine technology could still dominate even at the dawn of the jet age. Today, the thundering sound of its radial engine and its iconic bent-wing silhouette at air shows serve as a living monument, a powerful reminder of an aircraft that was not just effective, but truly legendary forever, earning its place in the pantheon of aviation giants.